On October 1st, the University of Bristol released a statement revealing that sociologist David Miller would no longer be teaching there. Despite the university's admission that Miller's comments did not constitute unlawful speech, in all vagueness they said that Miller, quote, didn't meet the standards of behavior they expect from faculty. This undoubtedly refers to remarks Miller had made in the past critical of Israel and Zionism. He, much like Jeremy Corbyn, had now been dubbed an anti-Semite and cast out from his place of work for criticizing Israel. A professor of political sociology, Miller was appointed to teach at the University of Bristol in 2018. He also co-founded and co-directs a non-profit organization called Public Interest Investigations that runs two key projects. One, the research wiki, powerbased.info, and two, Spinwatch, which investigates how the PR industry and corporate and government propaganda influence public debate and democracy. Well, first of all, Professor, let me just thank you for coming on the program. I hope you're well.
I am.
Could you just walk us through what happened? Could you maybe tell us the comments that you made initially, where they were? I think that's also important, and how they resulted in your termination from the University of Bristol.
Well, that's not as easy a job as you might think. The reason is because my comments weren't the start of this all. The start of this was when I was appointed to the University of Bristol in September 2018, and in February the following year I gave a lecture on Islamophobia, when I discussed the book which we edited, me and my colleagues, where we argue that there are 5 pillars to Islamophobia. First, of course, being the state counterterrorism apparatus, which is the key engine of anti-Muslim discrimination in the UK and in other countries. And that there are 4 other pillars of Islamophobia, which we refer to as social movements from above, that is, powerful social movements, one of which we say is parts of the Zionist movement. And it was that which got me into trouble in the first place. So 2 students apparently anonymously complained to the Community Security Trust, which I guess most of your viewers will know is an organization which claims to be there to counter anti-Semitism, but which isn't, in fact, an Israel lobby group, which finds it difficult, or rather deliberately can't tell the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Their complaint was rejected by the university because they weren't a student, so they encouraged the Union of Jewish Students, the president of the UJS, to write a letter, and she encouraged the president of the Bristol University Jewish Society, which is an affiliate of the UJS, to sign the letter. Now, that complaint was accepted because she was at that point a student at the University of Bristol. She wasn't my student, never been to my classes, doing a completely different subject. And they made a complaint which was absurd, which shouldn't have been accepted by the university, but was accepted by the university. And the university then rejected that complaint and said, no evidence of anti-Semitism here. Professor Mill was talking about Israel and its crimes and the crimes of the Zionist movement. The complaint was then appealed. And in this process, all the way through this process from early 2019, there's been a kind of manufactured campaign of hysteria about my alleged anti-Semitism, entirely false, defamatory allegations of anti-Semitism, which has been drummed up and reproduced by starting with the CST and then with the UGS and the Bristol JSOC, but also then subsequently a whole host of pro-Israel organizations, probably more pro-Israel organizations than most people know exist in the country. That is carried all the way through since 2019. Eventually that complaint, when it was appealed, I'm cutting a lot out here, was rejected, comprehensively, entirely rejected. The complaint that was originally made, the only element of it which was relevant, i.e. which related to my conduct at the University of Bristol, was said to be entirely without merit. And so that was a process which resulted in a QC's report reporting in December 2020 entirely exonerating me. So there was already a process here. And what got the most recent round of the process going in the way it did was when I participated in a Labour Against the Witch Hunt, Labour Campaign for Free Speech Zoom meeting on a Saturday afternoon outside of work, a political meeting, and I referred to the fact that the head of the JSOC and the head of the UGS had, and the words I used were, attacked and complained about me. I didn't say that the complaint was entirely without merit or rubbish and a fabricated complaint about anti-Semitism, which it was, but I just said it was that they had attacked and complained about me. And that led to a reaction, which itself got a further reaction, and then I made a couple of other responses to the press where journalists had asked me questions about stories they were writing on the basis of Union of Jewish Students or Bristol JSOC or the Students' Union statements, which, of course, all of which contained defamatory lies about me, calling me an anti-Semite, etc., calling for me to be sacked. And I issued robust responses to those. And then lastly, I wrote an article for the Electronic Intifada in the middle of February. And it was those statements which have eventually got me sacked, because even more high dudgeon was emanated from a whole series of different pro-Israel organizations, including the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Anti-Semitism, which is, some of you will no doubt know, many of you probably won't, is funded by and always has been, by Zionist funders linked to the State of Israel. As well, they corralled together more than 100 parliamentarians to condemn me and call for me to be sacked, etc. And there were many other calls from pro-Israel groups. So that's what happened. And the university, in the end, investigated this. There was no formal complaint from any student, as should be required by their processes. But nevertheless, the university decided to have an investigation. They investigated me. Part of the investigation involved a QC. The university have admitted that the QC found that none of my comments were unlawful, but they didn't go so far as to say that none of my comments were anti-Semitic, which is actually what the QC found. And again, that's in itself a problematic way to describe what happened.
They casually
I was found
left
again
that out.
to be. Sorry?
They conveniently left that out.
Yeah. And so I was found again for the second time that none of my comments had been in the least bit anti-Semitic. And nevertheless, the university has sacked me because of somehow the tone of my comments was not appropriate, and my comments had upset what they call Jewish students, by which they mean the key pro-Israel leaders of the JSOC at the University of Bristol, the executive, in fact, more senior than that, of the JSOC. So I had upset these students by referring to Zionism and calling for the end of Zionism. And that's what's got me sacked. No hint of racism, of course, or of unlawful comments.
Yeah, because they say in the media, and of course you just went through, talking about these so-called Jewish student groups who've lodged complaints against you. But are they actually, exclusively Jewish student groups or Zionist student groups? I think there's an important distinction to be made there, isn't there?
Sure, and this, of course, was part of the problem, was that I had said, look, the Union of Jewish Students, which oversees all Jewish student societies in the UK, is explicitly Zionist in its constitution. It declares that it is pro-Israel in its constitution, and it's deeply, deeply embedded in Zionist activism. And this is not a secret. They make statements all the time that they're Zionists. And of course, the Union of Jewish Students is itself formally a member of the World Union of Jewish Students, such that it has a seat by right on the executive of the World Union of Jewish Students, which is based, of course, in Jerusalem. And the World Union of Jewish Students, in turn, of course, is a member of the World Zionist Organization, and as such has the right to send delegates to vote for delegates, etc., at the Zionist Congress, the highest body of the Zionist movement. And I think, these are all matters of fact, but these are matters of fact which many people are not aware of. And when you say these facts, many people can get shocked and say, well, you're accusing Jews of Jew loyalty. You're saying that they're more loyal to Israel. And I say, well, no, I'm not talking about Jews. Or as a class, or Jewish students as a class. I'm talking about these specific Zionist organizations which have specific commitments in their own constitutions. So I didn't make this up. That's their constitutions in their words, which you can see on all of their websites.
Yep. Absolutely, and you know, when you call for the end of Zionism, could you explain what that means, what Zionism is? Because once again, you know, a lot of people conflate the two. They don't actually understand that it's a racist colonial movement in its core.
Sure. So I mean, obviously, one can talk about Zionism and there are debates about Zionism, but for me, what I'm talking about is, and I think this is a reasonable way of looking at it. It's not too far from what they themselves say about themselves. Zionism is a political ideology which was created to bring about the creation of a state of Israel as a home for the Jews, and then after it was created, to continue that state. And of course, it's a racist ideology, I would say, and its founders would say. I mean, people who defend it would say it's not, or they would try and say it's not. I mean, it's a racist ideology in the sense that it required to have within it a set of ideas and beliefs which had to regard the indigenous people of Palestine as either expendable, had to be removed, or not really being there at all. You know, there weren't really any Palestinians. We didn't really remove 750,000 of them in the NAP, but now everyone knows that's not true. But Zionism has to have that sense of anti-Palestinian, indeed anti-Arab racism at its core. And of course, that's not something which has just happened in 1948 or 1967. It continues today, as everyone in the world saw this in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and other places where ethnic cleansing continues to this day, because, you know, Zionism has to be a racist ideology because it has to have a set of views which require and justify the expulsion and the removal of the Palestinians, so that there can never be a meaningful Palestinian state, or such that there can never be a significant influence of Palestinians, Israeli Arabs as they call them, in Israeli politics. So it's an inherently racist ideology. When I talk about the end of Zionism, I'm talking about the end of an ideology. Just like we talk about, and in fact, the University of Bristol has a statement on its website about Black Lives Matter, talking about the eradication, and they use that word, and the dismantling of racism. Now, this is what we're talking about. We have to talk about dismantling this ideology. That doesn't mean we eradicate and dismantle individuals, or of course we're talking about the ideology and the conditions which give rise to that ideology, which is, of course, political processes. And to do that, you know, that of course will involve debate and other things too. But what we're talking about here is ending racism in just the same way as we are about ending racism more generally against Muslims in this country, and indeed against Black people more generally.
Do you think if you'd made the same exact comments about Saudi Arabia or Colombia, you would have been fired?
No, of course not. And what's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is, of course, the historical pool that there is in our culture still, and for partly for good reasons, because of the Shoah, because of the deaths in the Holocaust of 6 million Jews, and, you know, let's not forget the other millions and millions of victims of the Nazis. That's part of it, but partly also it's to do with the ability of the Zionist movement to activate politics in the UK and in the US and in other countries in a way which the pro-Colombian lobby or the pro-Saudi lobby doesn't have nearly the same kind of capacity. Of course, there is a pro-Saudi lobby, and I can talk to you about that. And of course, there's a pro-UAE lobby, for example. And interestingly, you know, you use the Saudi lobby as a kind of contrast, and it is a contrast. But the UAE, the Saudis, and the Israelis are all on the same page, really, in terms of their trying to influence this country. But no, of course, I can say what I want about the Saudis or the UAE or the Colombians, and of course, I could have said what I wanted about the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime invested millions and millions of pounds, dollars, rand in trying to influence politics in this country. They had covert operations, they had front groups, and just in the way that the Israel lobby has today. But the difference, of course, is that the Israel lobby is a much larger organization. It's a transnational organization. The institutions of the Zionist movement, which is, as I've sort of alluded to, is a formal movement of organizations which relate to each other. And in this country, I've mentioned the UGS is a formal member of the Zionist movement, but there are many other organizations in this country which are also formally part of the Zionist movement. The Zionist Federation, for example, has something like 35 or 40 members. Each of them is formally a member of the Zionist movement. And then, of course, there are other organizations like the UK branch of the Jewish National Fund, the organization in Palestine, which is responsible for the expropriation and theft of Palestinian land. So This is a very large set of organizations which are well funded, and the funding comes partly from Israel, yes, through, as we know, through the reporting of lots of journalists on this area from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, recently abolished, or it comes from what the Israelis refer to as the diaspora, which means, of course, Zionist organizations and Zionist philanthropies in Western countries, especially in the US, but also in the UK. And there's really significant sums of money comes from that, and that money flows both ways. So some of that money goes to Israel, and some of it comes from Israel to here. So it's a much more, much better organized and much better funded lobby than you would see in the case of the Colombians or indeed the Saudis. What one should say about this really is that this is, some people say, this talking about the Israel lobby gets things around the wrong way. That the power in the world is located with imperialism, especially with US imperialism, and to a lesser extent British imperialism in this historical period. And of course, that's true. But nevertheless, we can't determine which nations or organizations or movements are able to influence policy just by saying, well, the Americans are in charge, nothing else happens, nothing else matters. What we should do is we should look at this empirically. And if we find that the Colombians are actually much more powerful, or the Chinese lobby or the Russian lobby, as people sometimes do say, is much more powerful, then we find that. This is something which is an empirical question, which you cannot determine from the beginning just by theoretical conception. So that's my view, and my activity, my research in this area has always been empirical to see, is it the case that the Israel lobby has influence? In what circumstances? What kind of influence? When does it conflict with the British state? And when is it in alliance with the British state? And both of those things happen.
And Professor, you mentioned how much power these lobby groups have. We saw Jeremy Corbyn being ousted from Labour. Yourself, now you've been terminated at Bristol University. I mean, how do you see the state of British politics, British academia? Do you think this is going to get worse from here on out, that more people are going to get fired, that these lobby groups will feel emboldened to go after others?
Well, they do feel emboldened. I mean, if you read the Jewish Chronicle, they do feel emboldened. They feel that they have to clear out the rest of the cranks in British academia, of which I'm apparently a representative. It's not just me. They don't just want me out. They want anyone who raises the issue of Palestinian rights, anyone who will criticize the Israeli government in terms outside an incredibly narrow range of criticisms, and anyone who will stand up for the right of the Palestinians to resist occupation. Any of those things are anathema. And so what they want to try and do is to eliminate that. They want to eliminate the possibility that people will speak out in favor of Palestinian rights. And the reason they want to do that is because they can see that public opinion has turned, and has been turning for a while, but has turned markedly against the state of Israel. And we saw, and this is the interesting contrast, isn't it? We saw in the Labour Party conference just the other day quite a hard line motion for the Labour Party about apartheid Israel, etc., calling effectively for BDS, for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And that is a reflection of the popular revulsion there is towards the activities of the state of Israel. And that really, really worries them. And so what they have to do is have to try and control those institutions where that kind of opposition comes from. And in the case of the Labour Party, they have managed to control that. Now, they had, as everyone will recall, there was the 10 pledges that the Board of Deputies, again, a Zionist organization, not formally in the Zionist movement, but nevertheless has been for decades now a pro-Israel organization, calling for the 10 pledges for all Labour leadership candidates to effectively hand decision-making on the question of anti-Semitism over to the Israel lobby. And so the whole of the administration of the Labour Party is now effectively an asset of the Israeli government. And they want to do the same with academia. They want only to have friendly sources, for people who have the right opinion on Israel. And they hope that will defer and delay or stop the rising public revulsion that there is about the activities of the Israeli government.
Just as a last question, Professor, what can people do to fight against this, kind of foreign influence, to speak up for Palestinians, and to push back against such efforts to limit speech in favor of Palestinians and human rights?
Well, one of the things which I said before, which some people found controversial or didn't like, was that I said we have to directly target the Zionist movement. And I didn't mean that, that I have some kind of armed wing with bombs. We're going to, I mean, what I'm talking about here is targeting the Zionist movement in argument and raising the profile of the influence of the Zionist movement. And as I've said always, that this is an empirical question. The Zionist movement doesn't have magical powers. It certainly doesn't have powers which have anything to do with Jewish ethnicity. But it nevertheless has influence, and we can investigate that and expose it. And if we think that means too much influence by a foreign state, I would say a hostile foreign state, even though we have in this country, this country is an ally of Israel. We need to directly talk about Zionism and its power and what it is. By that I mean not just talk about the Israeli government and its human rights abuses, or even about the creation of the state of Israel and all of that, but directly about Zionism, which is an actually existing movement in the UK, in the US, and in many other countries, in France and Germany, etc., etc. So that means directly talking about the influence of Israel and the Zionist movement in domestic politics. And that's uncomfortable for some people, even people on the left. But that's where we have to go. We have to directly take on the Zionist movement and dismantle those organizations such that they cannot penetrate and control public institutions, parties, higher education, education more generally, the trade unions, councils, local government, etc., which is, of course, what they want to do. So that has to be at the forefront of the left's imagination. That one of the things we have to do is dismantle Zionism in this country.
Professor David Miller, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure having you on. Really grateful for you coming on the program.
It's a pleasure.